Please be seated.
Good morning. Everything before the jury comes.
Judge, we'll have one thing. We had some screenshots from the presentation on Wednesday, and I think the state is objecting to those screenshots being entered into evidence. We took a few, the state took a few, but the state has its position on that, which
take that up later, unless you especially want to do it now.
Judge, we could take it up along with all the evidence. I mean, if you wanted to housekeep all that stuff again, which I think we're going to have to go through some of these, we're fine taking it up then as well.
Okay, very good. Let's bring the jury.
Judge, the jury is all present and seated.
Thank you. Good morning. Morning. All right, welcome back, everyone. Defense's case, your next witness.
This for Jason Dandridge.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court, the jury, and the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name rather than your name.
Jason Dandridge, D-A-N-D-R-I-D-G-E.
Good morning, Officer Dandridge.
Good morning.
Tell by your uniform you're North Charleston Police.
I am.
And tell us a little bit about how long you've been there.
I started working for North Charleston Police Department in February of 2009.
Did you have prior experience in law enforcement?
I did. I worked with Dorchester County Sheriff's Office prior to that, leaving at the rank of sergeant in the K-9 unit.
Why don't we start with high school and bring us up to date on your background so that the jury can get an idea of what experience you bring with you to the courtroom today?
Certainly. I'm Charlestonian, North Charleston, raised. I went to Stahl High School. I actually dropped out from high school early on and got my GED and went into the United States Army. That was the only time I've been away from Charleston.
What year was this when you got your GED?
I believe it would have been 1996.
And upon leaving high school, getting your GED, you went into the military?
I did. I went into the United States Army, signed up to attend basic training in 1997, and entered the field of the Signal Corps communications, did communications encryption.
Were you married at the time?
I was not. I had a girlfriend initially, went to the recruiter station to talk about career opportunities, and we were going over the pay scale, and they showed me that I would make $430 extra a month if I was married. So we left the recruiter station and drove to the courthouse in Moncks Corner and got married. True story.
Did you receive an honorable discharge when you left the military?
I did. I was discharged due to medical conditions on an honorable level.
And what did you do after your discharge?
Came back home and did a little bit of work at Circuit City, the old Circuit City down by Aviation. And then I went to become a dispatcher at Dorchester County Sheriff's Office when I was 19.
Tell us about your experience as a dispatcher, what you did and what lessons you may have learned that paid off later in your career.
Certainly. It was an interesting job. I was a radio operator for the county sheriff as well as the smaller municipalities' police departments and EMS and fire throughout the county. And I also answered 911 calls and administrative phone calls. I learned that it was a serious job, that you get all sorts of things that happen that you wouldn't think happen on a normal basis. It's a stressful job from the dispatching view, and you get to learn a little bit about what goes on outside of that, do ride-alongs and things like that as well, maybe opportunities to help in other areas.
What did you learn about expediency, timing, the timeliness of responses?
Sure, well, there's the saying that seconds count, and they do. You learn that as a dispatcher. I remember one call that I took with a baby that was not breathing, and I gave instruction for CPR, and they were able to revive the child, and EMS arrived and took over, but the child lived through that. Also, you hear backup calls and things like that where, especially in a county setting, they may be further away than you want them to, and I've seen officers injured and things like that in the line of duty.
Now, how long did you operate the dispatch radio?
I did that until about 6 months after I turned 21, I believe.
And what did you do at that time?
I was sworn in as a deputy. It was in 2001.
And this is in Dorchester County?
It was.
And urban or rural areas that you patrol?
When I went to patrol, I did both. I was originally assigned to the middle of the county, which would have a good bit of populated areas in Somerville and things of that nature. And I also would go out through Ridgeville and out to the Edisto River and Gettysville area and things of that nature.
And you did that as they called it a deputy at Dorchester County. Is that similar to a patrol officer's duties?
That's correct. I was a patrol officer in those areas.
And what type of training did you receive before you were sworn in?
Well, aside from the dispatch training I went through, once I got sworn in and was in family court, I went through the reserve program as a reserve deputy and continued in family court until I went to the academy for my what's called a LE1 certification, which is your basic law enforcement certification. Prior to that, I'd also done some help and some hands-on learning with things maybe searches and assist with certain things like that, be it perimeter for manhunt or some type of a line search for, a missing juvenile or something along that nature.
Tell us a little bit about searches and line searches and your experience with that.
So the first one I was involved with, there was an autistic child in the St. George area that was missing, and on days that I wasn't working, I would volunteer my time once or twice, I think, to go out there and do what we call it a line search, which is essentially you have a big area, you get as many people as you can with so distance apart, whether it's fingertip to fingertip or maybe 5-10 feet apart, and you walk a line looking for anything at all that may stand out, not just the child himself, but maybe a tennis shoe or a toy or something small that he might have dropped or something of that nature.
And how long did you stay with Dorchester County?
I was with Dorchester County. When I started dispatching there, it was April Fool's Day. That's no joke either. 1999, and I left there in January of 2009.
And what did you do at that time?
I was a sergeant in the K-9 unit, and I was also a patrol shift supervisor.
And when you left, what did you do?
I came to work for the city of North Charleston as a patrol officer.
And were you assigned a particular area?
I was assigned to South Knights Team 1.
Tell the jury, please, what that means. What does South Team 1 mean?
Sure. So in North Charleston, the city is split up into 3 sections. South would be the south part of the city, central would be the central part of the city, and north would be the north end of the city. So south would include Rivers Avenue from Durant down Sproul Avenue through Union Heights area and back up Azalea Drive through Dorchester Road to the 526 area. And nights was a shift from 10 at night till 7 in the morning.
And how long did you do that, officer?
I did that for about 7 months, I believe.
Well, walk the jury through your experience up until April 4th of 2015, the type of experiences you had in terms of your job and the different locations you worked and the hours you worked.
Okay. I went from patrol to the saturation unit, which was a unit that would have 2-person units rather, assigned to areas that has statistical high crime tracking. And in that time I was assigned to Charleston Farms Remount Road area. I did that for about 4 or 5 months, and I went to the K-9 unit. I was in the K-9 unit. You were assigned mostly to the city, but every now and then, due to crime tracking statistics, they would maybe put you in another area. Those times for both saturation and K-9 were generally 6 in the afternoon till 2, or 6 in the evening till 2 in the morning, or 7 in the evening till 3 in the morning. And then after K-9 service, I went back to patrol, where I worked the North Bureau on the north end of the city, initially nights and then days.
So you've had a pretty, at least geographical spread of experience in North Charleston?
I have.
And also different hours and shifts.
Correct.
And did you ever take on collateral duties other than just being a K-9 officer or a patrol?
With Dorchester County, I did a few collateral. I was on the SWAT team for 6 years, and I did honor guard. I've also, while at Dorchester County, became what's called a specific skills instructor through the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. And that's basically a certification that allows me to instruct a variety of different types of areas of law enforcement that have a lesson plan already written. And I've also got involved with teaching active shooter response. I've been through various classes and have a federal certification to instruct active shooter response through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and I'm also a firearms instructor through the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy.
Let's break that down.
Yes, sir.
Firearms instructor. What firearms?
So firearms instructor would allow you to teach and qualify annually law enforcement within the state of South Carolina concerning their duty weapon their sidearm.
So is a firearms instructor restricted to training just for the weapon that's holstered, the Glock 22 or 21?
We are also able to do qualification on what's considered off-duty carry, maybe a smaller gun you might carry when you're off-duty, but for the most part, it's handgun.
Who would be, what would the terminology be for the long rifle or the shotgun that is sometimes carried by a patrol?
So rifle certification and training would be done through a rifle instructor, patrol rifle instructor.
And is that type of training different in terms of the number of hours spent in training and the type of training for, I'd call it long guns as opposed to pistols?
Sure, it is.
So your experience in training is limited to pistols, is that correct?
As far as firearms certification, now I've been through other courses. I'm a certified patrol rifle officer, but I don't teach it.
Now, tell us a little bit about North Charleston patrolmen in the time frame of 2010 to 2015, the type of training they received for pistol firearms.
For pistol firearms, there's been times where we've had a couple of days where we maybe could do some type of a static training at a range, but for the most part, it's, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, it's all been just qualification only.
There must be a difference, as I understand what you're saying, between qualification and training.
Correct.
And what I hear you saying is there was qualification, but training not so much.
That's correct. Here recently.
Tell the jury the type of activity in terms of firearms and use of firearms that a patrolman would have in North Charleston in that time frame. What do you mean qualification versus training?
Okay, so qualification would be a standard that's set that every officer in the department should pass that standard or meet that standard in order to continue to carry their firearm. And it is a 40-round course that goes out to 15 yards. It starts at 3 yards. And there's stages in between with distance. At each stage, the firearms instructor will give a instruction to the officers that are qualifying, and then he would give them a command, what we say a command of threat. They would shoot at that point so many rounds that they were told to shoot within an allotted time.
Is there any training component to the qualification?
No, sir.
And the qualification was done once a year?
That's correct.
Tell the members of the jury where qualification is done and the type of shooting that is engaged by the trainee.
Okay, so the qualification is done at Trader World, which is a gun range, an indoor gun range on Cross County Road. And you have about 6 officers that line up at a time. They have 40 rounds with their firearm and their magazines on their belt. And you would give them the commands at each stage to go through, like I said, be it maybe 5 rounds in 6 seconds or something of that nature at each stage. There would be a stage where you would have to shoot with single hand, and you would switch from one hand to the other and shoot. And there would be some stages where you have to do a magazine exchange, but most of it's drawn from the holster, with the exception of the 15-yard area. They come out and stay out at a position called the ready, and then they're given a certain amount of shots within a certain amount of time, like two rounds in 2 seconds, that sort of thing.
Is the type of qualification that's done once a year, one of the criteria is time?
That's correct. You have so much time at each stage to get the allotted amount of rounds.
So in order to be qualified, it has to be rapid firing?
Some of the stages are quicker than other, but there's not time in between the shots. you do have a short amount of time on, you can't just take a lot of time.
Tell the jury, if you will, about the target. Is it a moving target, a pop-up target? Tell us a little bit about the activity itself.
At the time of shooting, with each stage, it is what we would say static or still. It does not move at all. It is on a pulley system to where when you go from one distance to the other, 3 yards to 5 yards to 7 to 15, you hit a button and it moves out on the pulley system, but then it stops at the distance that you want it to stop at, and then the next instruction is given from the firearms instructor doing the qualifying.
And tell us about the trainee or the qualification person, the person who's being qualified. Are they moving, or is it a fluid situation or a stationary situation?
It's very stationary. They're in what we call a lane. At that range, there are walls to mark each lane. You can't really do any moving at all. They draw from the holster is the only movement they do during this qualification other than magazine exchanges. But as far as their feet, there's no movement at all. It's very static.
How about, is there stress induced to see how an operator, how an officer would fire under stress?
No, sir, there's none.
Is there a difference between going to a fire range and qualifying in real life use of a firearm in the process of being engaged in your police work?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
And this is the once-a-year certification, correct?
That's correct.
Supposing somebody with my capability was there and they didn't qualify in the 40 shots, then what?
You would go through what's called a remedial training session with an instructor, and then you would qualify again, or attempt to qualify again.
And I can take the test as many times as I want until I pass?
I don't believe so, but I don't know. I've never done a remedial level. It would go to maybe a higher Sergeant Glover or somebody in training at that point.
And that is what patrolmen go through once a year with North Charleston.
That's correct.
Is there other firearms training for patrolmen?
Somebody crowded area and opening fire, a target-rich environment and opening fire to try to kill as many people as they can. Everybody here is aware that what's been coined as active shooter incidents or active threat incidents have been on a rise in recent past that would involve somebody going into a crowded area and opening fire, a target-rich environment and opening fire to try to kill as many people as they can in a given time. And that's it's been an area that I've tried to focus my training and my abilities to help others train in, since it's become such a popular thing.
This goes back to Columbine.
Correct. Well, further than that, but the Columbine's what made it popular recently.
Tell the jury, if you will, the change in philosophy about active shooter training.
Before active shooter training became a thing, a lot of the standard operating procedures was for officers to wait for an appropriate amount of backup depending on the situation that was at hand. The mentality has changed a lot to, if you're there, you got to stop the threat because there's innocent lives dying. So the active shooter response and active shooter training and things of that nature have been geared towards trying to help maybe a single officer or a couple of officers be able to go into a crowded environment like that to locate and isolate and eliminate the incident as it's ongoing.
So the previous philosophy was to wait until SWAT or some specialized law enforcement personnel would be at the scene, and that changed because lives were being lost.
Correct.
The post-Columbine current training is for the patrolman. Whoever that might be, the first one on the scene goes directly to the active shooter and tries to eliminate that as a threat to the children or population.
Correct.
And so what type of training then, well, first of all, If there was an active shooting in North Charleston, who would be the first responders to that?
It would be the patrol officers.
And what type of,
I'm sorry, we have SROs in majority of our schools, but, so I imagine if it was a school incident, hopefully we would have SRO there that could do it, but in general, it's patrol officers that are the first ones.
so if it was a situation at the mall, or
Correct.
the train station, the bus station, airport, wherever, it would be the patrol officer?
Correct.
And they'd also respond to the school as well? Correct?
That's right.
College campus or grammar school, or anything in between?
Correct.
Now, what type of training would a patrol officer in North Charleston have for that scenario?
So a couple years ago, the department was approved to put every officer through what we called active shooter training or active shooter response training. It was an entire day that was comprised of some classroom, a PowerPoint presentation and instruction, and then it went out to an area that we would call the glass house, which was basically a building, a floor plan set out by traffic cones so that we could practice movement and strategic approaches and things of that nature. And then from there, we would go to a vacant school, and we would run scenarios in that school for the rest of the day using what's called simunition guns.
Tell the jury, if you will, what simunition guns are.
Simunition guns are firearms that are real, so if we carry Glocks, then we would have a Glock simunition gun, but the barrel and the upper slide is changed out to where it fires a round that is, instead of it being a metallic round, it's a plastic bubble that contains a colored soapy water, kind of like paintball.
And tell us, the best you can, what that training consists of. Are they stress-induced?
They were stress-induced to the point of yelling, excitement, noises, things of that nature, scrutiny from the instructors, and then the overall stress of going into a situation where you may get shot at by another simunition gun or something of that nature.
And we've heard the term de-escalation. Is there anything that you can tell us about de-escalation training?
So in active shooter response, particularly, there may be an incident where the threat maybe stops himself and goes into a room and becomes what we call a barricaded subject, and that would be treated a little bit differently. Maybe something along that lines with active shooter.
Does de-escalation connote a conversation with the suspect?
If it allows, correct.
So in the scenarios that you employ in active shooter training would be de-escalation when somebody hides in the closet or under the bed or whatever?
The mission, their actions dictate, but if they allow for us to not use firepower, then we will slow down and try to negotiate with them or something of that nature.
In the training for use of firearms, is there, we've heard the term reassessment, but tell us what that means.
So a reassessment is, once force is applied, you would reassess the situation to see if there would be any more force needed.
Well, tell us, give us something graphic, give us something that the jury can pick up on what
Okay,
assessment means.
certainly. So if for instance, if I used a taser and the subject that I was using the taser on complied after using that taser, for instance, if he fell to the ground and stopped at that point, once the 5 seconds from the taser is up, I would reassess before making any further action to see what proper action would be called for. And if from past experiences, the 5 seconds is over and you give a command to put your hands behind your back. If they put your hands behind your back, then the force would stop at that point. If he attempts to get up or try to fight from that point on, then I would be justified in using another 5 second burst from the taser.
So is reassessment, that idea of reassessment both for less than lethal force as well as lethal force.
It is correct.
And that's conditioned upon the suspect's behavior.
Correct, whether the threat is stopped or not is what we teach.
Were you working on April 4th, 2015?
I was.
Tell the members of the jury where you were, what you were doing that morning in the neighborhood of 9 to 10 o'clock.
I was working the north area of the city, and I had met with another officer, and we were grabbing a breakfast at Subway that was by the Publix on Dorchester, Ashley Phosphate area, Park Forest Parkway.
Did you monitor your radio communications at that time?
I was monitoring the north channel.
As far as the staffing of the north area that morning, do you have recollection of personnel available that morning?
From what I recall, it was myself and 2 other patrol officers and a sergeant.
And what would be the complement that you should have had, or if all things were, if everybody had reported, how many of the patrolmen would have been there that morning?
I believe there's 6 assigned, 6 car units assigned.
And so you were running about 50% manpower that morning?
As far as the availability of patrol car that was on patrol, that's correct.
Tell the jury in terms of availability of patrol car, there must be some meaning to that as opposed to personnel.
Sure. There was some trainees that were recently graduated from the academy who were going through what we call field training, and there were 2 of them, 1 assigned to each other person that was working north that day.
So you'd have 2 uniforms, if you will, in a vehicle, one who's fully qualified and one who's in training.
That's correct.
So the number of uniforms that day is different from the number of police officers who could take action that day.
Correct. So, yeah. That's
And,
right.
2 of the uniforms that morning were in training, correct?
Correct.
Without putting words into your mouth, but men and women who are undergoing training are not permitted to carry out the duties of a trained officer.
They're allowed to, but they're legally allowed to. But they're limited within the training scope to depending on what part of their FTO stage. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm also a field training officer with North Charleston, so I also partake in doing this training. Depending on what stage they are, depends on what, I don't want to use the words freedoms they have to do about, but when they first graduate from the academy and come into the FTO program, it's almost like they're doing a ride-along at first, and they're observing what we do. And then,
We don't know what ride-along, remember this?
okay, sorry, sure. Basically, they sit in the car and watch what we do for the first couple of days, and then we may have them start to answer the radio, or they can come with us on calls and interact with the public a little bit more, and it progresses throughout their field training to where maybe towards the last week they're doing everything on their own, and now the field training officer is the one that's riding and observing.
But always with a supervisor.
Correct.
Do the trainees require the patrol officer to keep track of what they're doing? In other words, not being able to be fully dedicated to their position as well?
That's correct. We at daily fill out what's called a daily observation report that details what we've. It's 31 things on the form that we have to check whether we observed or did not observe, and then you have to write a narrative on it for maybe a pro and a con, and then there's area for further comments. So throughout the day, the training officer is doing an evaluation on the trainee.
So that morning, you heard radio communications.
I did.
As those radio communications pertain to Officer Slager and the incident involving Mr. Scott, would you tell the jury your recollection of what happened?
I will. better understand, let me explain that each bureau, north, central, and south, has their own channel on the radio. And so you're on your own channel, but if there's an emergency status, which is where the radio channel is reserved for one particular incident, so that nobody crowds the radio traffic if somebody's in an emergency, if that channel goes into what's called emergency status, every channel gets notified because more officers may have to respond from one area to the city to the other. So while we were in subway, we heard that the central channel was being put into emergency status for a foot pursuit, at which time one of us, which is common, switched over to the central channel to monitor it, and the other one remained on the north channel in case something else came across on the north channel. And we started to listen to the pursuit.
So your recollection of Officer Slager that morning, your attention was drawn by what radio broadcast?
Well, initially, again, it was an announcement that Central was in emergency status. When I flipped over to the Central channel, I heard Mike call for badge number 156, and he yelled for...
Now, I know you're Mike, but let's refer to Officer Slager as Officer Slager.
I'm sorry. Officer Slager called for Officer Habersham by his badge number, which was 156, and what sounded to me as a heightened emotion, and he asked him to step it up, and that immediately the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because for those who knew Officer Habersham, we understand that he's a kind of a juggernaut guy. He's built and very strong, and it's not common for an officer to ask for somebody specific by badge number, and I took that to mean that Officer Slager was being physically overpowered and he needed somebody that was strong. That's how I took it. At that point, I kind of stopped and just waited, kind of say something else, because we were starting to get worried. And then that's when Officer Slager announced that shots had been fired and that that his taser was grabbed. We then left immediately and started heading to the Remount Road area with our emergency equipment activated.
Tell the jury what you did upon arrival at the incident site.
When I arrived, I went to the location of the traffic stop, as a couple of other officers had gotten to the location of the fight and the shots being fired. So I went to go help and see what I could do with the scene where the traffic stop was, and I met up with Officer Banez, who was already on scene.
And what did you do upon arrival at where Officer Banez was?
Basically, we held the perimeter. I put up crime scene tape and, started what we call a crime scene log, which is where you keep track of whoever may cross the tape, be it officers, citizens, medical personnel, or anybody else, and that log will usually get recorded and turned in either through the report or through records department.
At the incident site, did you have an opportunity to observe Officer Slager?
I did. The only time I saw Officer Slager was while he was speaking with Lieutenant Bowman. I looked down the alleyway and saw him, his pants were rolled up and they were looking at his knee, I believe.
And did you speak to him at the incident site?
Not there on scene, no, sir.
What did you do when you left the incident site? Why did you leave the incident site, and what did you do at that time?
Okay, I was asked, I believe by Sergeant Webb, to meet with Chaplain Dewey, to go to Officer Slager's home, to meet with his wife, and to give her as much as we could give her detail-wise on what had happened, and then to pick up some clothes and to bring those clothes to City Hall to give to Officer Slager so he could change out of his uniform.
Before you left the incident site, were you ever requested did you see SLED there?
I did. I saw a sled arrived. I'm not sure where they arrived first, but I spoke with Angela Peterson on scene at the traffic stop.
And did she or anyone else ask you to participate in a line search or any type of search at all for evidence?
No, sir.
Did you you ever observe anybody searching the crime scene for evidence?
I did not.
And after you left the scene, you went with chaplain duty? You were asked to, or you actually went with them?
I was asked to, and I went with. I met him at the Hanahan Police Department and drove to their house.
And did you then go back to City Hall?
I did. I took the clothes as requested to City Hall.
And do you recall what you did at City Hall, if you had any interaction with Officer Slager at that time?
I did. I met him up in the patrol room on the second floor and gave him the clothes that I was requested to bring to him.
And was he dressed when you got there?
He was still in his uniform, if I remember correctly.
And do you recall that you or anybody else took his clothing at that time?
I did not.
And did anybody else take his clothing in your presence?
No, sir, not that I remember.
Did he have his weapon at that time, his weapon being his Glock, his weapon being his taser?
The only thing I remember was that I believe the training unit was there issuing him a new firearm. I don't recall. I remember the firearm box being on the table, but I don't recall where the firearm itself was.
Did you have a conversation with him?
I did.
What was the nature of the conversation you had with him?
We spoke a little bit about houses.
Objection to anything Officer Slager told him is hearsay, Your Honor.
The objection sustained.
So that would be the conversation you had with Officer Slager immediately after his arrival at the police station. Don't say what it is, but you had a conversation with him.
I did.
And as a result of that conversation, did you have a better grasp of what happened that moment?
I had a better, I did. I didn't have detail, but maybe a little bit understanding of what he might have been going through mentally.
Apparently, you can't give us that statement, but following that statement, what did you do?
Following the statement that he gave me, I was, basically it was my understanding that it was instinctive.
You can't go into details of the statement.
I'm sorry.
What did you do following that conversation? Did you leave, or did you accompany him anyplace else, or did you go back to duty, or what did you do?
I went back to duty. I did not have any further interaction with him.
And with respect to the SLED investigator, did you provide a statement to her about what you did that morning, just like you did to the jury?
Not that day. No, I did not.
And when did you do that?
I don't remember the exact date, but it was maybe a week or two later.
The day that you were involved in this, did you record in your computer the notes of what you had done that day?
I did. I went to, after the day was over and we went back to finish paperwork and things of that nature, I went to enter in what we call a supplemental report, which is an extra narrative as to what we did with our response. That supplemental narrative was already typed up on a thumb drive. When I opened up the reporting system to put my supplemental in, the initial narrative page that would come up on a reporting system was not there. And usually it's there and you go to add your supplemental to it. And if you don't add your supplemental properly, you could take the place of the main narrative. And because the main narrative wasn't there, I wasn't quite sure what happened, so I asked my sergeant what I should do, because I already had the narrative typed up and wanted to put it in there and be done with it. And he told me to wait until we come back. This was the last day of our work rotation. We were going to be off for 3 days. And he instructed me just to keep it on my thumb drive, to wait, and then to put it into report once it's done.
Your record of your activity, your observations on April 4th were recorded on April 4th.
That's correct.
And that recording, your notes then became, did you use those to refresh your memory in speaking to SLED a few days later,
That's correct.
including the statement given to you
I don't recall specifically whether or not the narrative has that quote in there or not, but I wouldn't want to say wrong. I apologize. I don't know if that actual quote was in there or not, or whether it was just more of what I did when I was on scene.
And all that, though, was turned over to SLED.
It was. I did write a statement when I turned that over to SLED, where some further question and answering was done on a statement form. And my conversation that day with Officer Slager was recorded on that.
And the SLED agent that interviewed you was Peterson, or was it somebody else?
It was somebody else, and I don't recall his name, a tall, slender, blonde fellow.
And they asked you specific questions, you answered any question they may have had.
Absolutely.
There's been some discussion about malice. And I suppose you're familiar with malice from your training in both the academy and at North Charleston.
Yes, sir.
Is handcuffing a suspect following a shooting what you're trained to do?
It is.
Give us a little more in depth of that so the jury has an understanding why Officer Slager handcuffed Mr. Scott following the shooting.
Anytime you use force or effect an arrest, you handcuff the person, and that's policy. But as far as the force goes, you're never sure what effect the force used has. So you want to detain them to further assess the situation safely, so that you or anybody around you won't get hurt, or that the suspect that you've used force on won't get hurt if further force is needed.
With respect to the continuum of force, you haven't been here, but we've heard about that. In assessing the level of force that you use, are there criteria that you're trained with at both the academy and subsequent training at North Charleston? Things that you look at in terms of the strength and individual abilities of the person who you're taking into custody?
That's correct. We are trained to understand that not everybody's created equally as far as their experiences, their training, and their physical stature, and that can be taken into consideration when using force. And I believe our policy dictates that as well.
So if somebody is a weightlifter or uses martial arts, that would be part of it?
Absolutely.
If somebody is a weightlifter or uses martial arts, you wouldn't necessarily know that until you're in the fight.
That's correct.
So you can evolve that use of force during a confrontation.
Correct.
Have you been tased?
I have not.
Have you seen the effects of a drive stun?
I have.
Tell the jury about that, please.
So a drive stun is basically a stun maneuver where instead of a cartridge being fired that sends out the leads that carry electricity, you're touched with the taser itself. This can be done without the cartridge attached, and it can be done with the cartridge still attached. And depending on where that is applied, to my understanding of taser training, depending on where that's applied, it could be a pain compliance issue, or it could be a stun issue.
Are you trained, and do you train that if somebody removes your taser from you, takes your taser, that it is lethal force is appropriate?
That's correct.
In your training and experience, do you understand the difference between misdemeanors and felonies?
For the most part, yes, sir. And
if somebody is resisting arrest and assaulting the officer arresting him, is that a felony?
That is a felony.
Under the laws of the state of South Carolina, if somebody disarms you from your taser, is that a felony?
That is a felony.
If somebody engages in common law robbery by taking your taser, is that a felony?
That is a felony.
If somebody assaults and batters a police officer in the course of their duties, is that a felony?
It can reach felony, yes, sir.
Officer Dandridge, thank you. Just give me one moment, please.
Sure.
As is often the case, I forgot to ask you a couple of things. Have you ever experienced a traumatic event in which your senses were distorted?
I have.
Tell the jury about that, please.
This was shortly after I graduated the academy in 2002. I was about 30 seconds behind two officers that were changing the tire on a car on Boone Hill Road. Both officers got run over. I didn't even see them, but I was stopped by a citizen, and they yelled that they needed help. And in the course of detaining the person who was trying to leave and trying to render aid to the officers that were injured due to the collision, I experienced some sights that I hadn't seen before and some emotion that I hadn't seen before. After that incident, I was asked to write a statement, and when I was discussing the events to recall them, the people that were with me were telling me that those were not what had happened and that I had it wrong. And I began to actually argue with them about it. And it wasn't until I went back out to the scene to look at it that I realized that the facts that I recalled were incorrect. And there's also some other incidents I went through that while going through them, maybe I did some things that were not good, maybe called out a wrong location or asked a silly question to a possible suspect or something of that nature. One of them was that incident when I rolled up on the officers that were run over. I called that event out as being on Dorchester Road between Orangeburg and Bacon's Bridge, and I was on Boone Hill Road between Orangeburg Road and the 90-degree curve. And then on the second one, I responded to an officer that was ambushed during a domestic investigation where he was shot with a shotgun. And in the process, he had moved his car to get away from the person who was shooting him. And I was looking for his car and didn't find it. So I passed where he was, and when I came back through, there was a citizen who had come out because of the commotion. And I asked the citizen if he's the one that shot him. And the citizen said no. And I said, where'd he go? And he pointed down a road, and I took off down that road. It was, looking at it later, it was almost comical because he could have been the suspect telling me to go a different direction. Both of which are things that are somewhat embarrassing, but I come to understand when looking into it that I guess when you have adrenaline dumps or things of that nature, experiences you're not used to, you react differently.
I'll answer any questions the prosecutor might have, officer.
Thank you.
By the state.
And Officer Dandridge, that's because officers are just like everybody else, aren't
That's correct.
they? They're human beings.
Human
right?
beings, yes, sir.
And like everybody else, officers are happy when the occasion is appropriate.
You have times of happiness, I'm sure, and joy in your life,
Sure,
and sadness,
sure,
and anger.
sure.
And because you're a human being and you go through the same panoply of emotions that every other human being does. Correct?
Correct.
And all human beings are like that because that's the way we are. Correct?
Well, correct. We have a motion, sure.
And police officers are no different than anybody else when it comes to that. Correct?
Correct. We have emotions.
Now, you talked a little bit about active shooter training, and that is scenario-based training, correct?
That's correct.
And stress-based training, correct?
As best as we're allowed to do. Yes, sir.
Correct. And I mean, obviously, you're not allowed to go into training where people are really put in fear of their life, and using real ammunition. I understand that, but the active shooter training y'all went through, was that good training?
I believe it was relatively good, sure.
Okay, do you recall when that was?
It took almost a year, maybe 2013, 2014,
Okay, and everybody in the department took it, correct?
to my understanding.
Including Officer Slade.
To my understanding, everybody went through it.
So, he did have some stress-based training, correct?
If he went through the active shooter course, he had stress that was induced from like screaming and stuff like that.
Right, and these were kind of don't shoot scenarios, correct?
Sure.
And it could be somebody with a phone in his hand versus somebody with a pistol in their hand.
I guess that could be a scenario.
And he certainly had more training than the average guy on the street, has he not?
Yes, sir. As far as law enforcement, sure.
And because he goes through an annual in-service mandatory training every year, or did with North Charleston Police Department, correct?
He's supposed to. I can't remember. I'm sure he has.
Well, you have to keep your certification.
That's correct.
And you do.
That's correct.
And that's 3 days of training per year, is that correct?
I think it's been shortened.
Okay. And it involves firearms every year, correct, or qualification?
Right. They're not doing that as part of AIMS, just to be completely
Okay. So
objective.
Firearms is separate.
Separate from AIMS. Yes, sir.
Training. But you have legal training, correct?
That's correct.
Training in the y'all's policy, North Charleston Police Department policy, as part of your other training, for example.
I don't know that we have like any refresher course on policy. If any policy changes, maybe a memo will come out throughout the year about it or something of that nature.
Yes, but I mean, and part of AIMS, you instruct on changes in policy, correct?
Not that I can recall. That all comes through memo.
So how about the actual training itself, when you're being trained on tasers, for example? Y'all don't train what your policy is on tasers?
No, sir. We will train tasers specifically during AIMS, and we have to go through, when we do a use of force training, we go through use of force and maybe recent case laws and things like that. So, for instance, this past year there was a change in use of force that affected the taser, so I believe they went over that. Yes, sir.
So as part of your every year taser training, for example, y'all not taught the North Charleston Police Department policy on the use of tasers?
We go through instruction on using a taser. I'm sure that whoever the instructor is for that can talk about policy, but I'm not a taser instructor. I don't know that it's specific that we go through policy on taser.
And so your testimony is North Charleston Police Department does not instruct on the use of force?
No, sir. We instruct on use of force. When you do firearms instruction, which I can maybe more relate to because I'm a firearms instructor, we're supposed to go over a use of force policy, maybe in a PowerPoint presentation or classroom setting. I believe this past year it was a handout that we gave everybody at the range, but there wasn't a discussion on it. We handed it to them.
I understand that, but the point is, when y'all are taught specific things like taser or firearms and things of that nature, y'all are taught
the use of force policy, correct?
We have the use of force policy. The recertification in TASER may involve more hands-on, like tasing a static target or things of that nature. Whatever the instructor talks about in their PowerPoint, I'm sure they can bring up policy. I don't know what the criteria is that they have to meet, so I don't know that I can say it's definitively at every Ames. I don't know. They can, certainly.
And y'all do teach reassessment during your training, correct? To reassess the threat.
Correct.
And that's supposedly every use of threat is like every pull of a trigger, correct?
Well, that's the saying that I've heard, that every swing of the baton is a separate use of force, or every pull of the trigger. And
Every use of the taser is considered a separate use of force.
correct. Correct. And so basically what that means is if you tase them and they comply, then you stop tasing. Or if you have to strike them and they comply, then you stop striking them, something of that nature.
Okay. And of course, as a police officer, y'all are trained to use restraint, correct?
Use restraints? Yes, sir.
Restraint.
Restraint?
Restraint. In
Sure.
dealing with the public.
Sure.
I mean, you don't, obviously are not trained to go out there and beat up everybody you see.
Correct. Correct.
And y'all encounter a lot of stressful situations as police officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
And y'all hear a lot of things said about you that are not nice, correct?
Correct.
And you are taught or tried to use restraint in those situations, correct?
That's a fair assessment, sure. Sometimes you don't even have to use restraint because you know it's just people talking and it's not personal.
Right. But it's difficult.
From what they say to us?
It's difficult sometimes for officers to use restraint, isn't it?
I can't speak for everybody. I've never had trouble using restraint, but I don't.
Well, that's true because most officers don't shoot anybody, do they?
I would imagine that. I don't know the statistics, but that's a fair statement.
You've never shot anybody.
I have
correct?
not.
And you've never shot anybody in the back, have you?
I've never shot anybody.
And you've never shot anybody in the back from 18 feet away as they were running away, have you?
I've never been in a situation that would dictate me needing to do that.
And y'all are certainly not trained to do that, are you?
I wouldn't say that. I think what we're trained on is stopping the threat.
So you're telling this jury that you are trained to shoot somebody in the back who is running away from you 18 feet away unarmed. That's what you're trained to do?
What we were trained to do as part of our training with firearms is to stop the threat. And if a certain criteria is met, then shooting somebody in the back while they're running away at 18, 20, or 30 feet even is not unjustified.
Okay, and how is an unarmed person running away from you at 18 feet a threat to you?
I guess that would depend on the situation that led to me having to shoot.
Okay, well, tell me the situation to you that would warrant you shooting someone in the back that was unarmed at 18 feet away and a dead run from you.
You want me to just make a scenario up?
I'm saying in terms of being a threat to you, can you tell me that? Why? Under what circumstances?
Well, I guess it could be a variety of circumstances. Is that what you want me to come up with an example?
You just said that, yes, for you. Can you tell me a circumstance where you would be threatened from someone running away from you at 18 feet without being armed?
Sure. To be specific, it's not just me. It would be me or the community, as far as referring to like fleeing felon or things of that nature. We can what if all day long, but for an example, if somebody has tried to kill somebody and they're fleeing towards an area of potential victims, depending on the circumstances, it would be justifiable to shoot that person in the back as they're running away.
Okay, so if you observe somebody trying to kill somebody else and they were running away, you could do that?
If they're running away to maybe an area that would have potential other victims, or to prevent any kind of potential loss of life or injury to others, be it other officers or other citizens.
So the bottom line is that y'all are trained to do that,
At certain times, that's a discussion, sure,
to shoot people in the back.
if it's
they're
needed.
running away.
If it's needed.
Okay. North Charleston is an accredited law enforcement agency, correct?
That's correct.
And you've talked to us previously, and you were happy with the training in North Charleston Police Department, correct?
No, I don't believe I'd say I was happy. I said relatively certain things about it have been better than other areas.
Better than other departments that you worked at, correct?
Correct, or other surrounding agencies. I would like to see a lot of improvement, but I think the active shooter training that we did 3 or 4 years ago, I think was a definite advancement in our training.
Okay. And, but relative to other police departments, has your training in North Charleston been better than in Dorchester County, for example?
As far as a personal level, I had better training when I was at Dorchester County. I just took advantage personally of, I was able to go to, for instance, train with the Washington Field Office FBI SWAT team at Quantico up in Virginia. I did that for 2 weeks, 2 different years. I've had several SWAT schools and canine schools and drug interdiction schools, things that I self-initiated and put in for that I was granted. As far as the overall put everybody through training, I don't, it's qualifications and service at both places.
And there's a reason for that too, correct? I mean, not everybody can be trained like they're on the SWAT team when they're not on the SWAT team, correct?
That's a fair statement, sure.
And why is that?
I don't know.
It's,
I wish they could be.
it's
Well, I
that's
think
the
that's fair to
reason.
say. There's a lot of, like, my training and the training itself was free. Of course, there's travel and expenses there, but yeah, I think when it comes to any kind of tacticalness and even maybe certain legal updates, I think law enforcement across the country lacks in a great way.
Yeah, and because training can always be better, whatever profession
Sure.
you're in, correct?
Sure.
And so would you rate North Charleston's training as better, worse, or in the middle?
Well, I would like to see it improve. I'm pretty critical. I think it should be better.
Okay. And, let's see. Also, as part of your training, do you recall the phrase ability, opportunity, jeopardy?
I do.
Could you explain to the jury what that means?
So ability, opportunity, and jeopardy is I guess a lot of people refer to it as a 3-pronged test for using force. Does the person that the force being used against have the ability, the opportunity, and is there jeopardy involved? Somebody that doesn't have the ability to carry out a threat that they're making or presenting would maybe not meet that 3-pronged test, or somebody who does not have the opportunity, even though they have the ability, may meet that, and even though they meet the ability and opportunity, is there jeopardy present, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and that's taught in use of force situations and specifically use of deadly force situations.
Correct.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Redirect. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
The next witness. I'll give you a few minutes break, ladies and gentlemen. If you go to the jury room, we'll come back shortly. We'll take a few minutes.